collage. In those years with Divine Mother, there were many witnessings, and one of them was a couple. They were maybe in their late 50s or their early 60s, who used to come to the meditations occasionally because they lived on the big island of Hawaii. They had an orchid farm there, and they used to come quietly, and they would sit right at the back, the little crowded room. And then, as was Divine Mother's wont, just out of the blue, one day, she pointed to the man and she said, "You have something to say." And out it babbled. He said, "Oh, we're getting old and we don't have any social security and we don't have any children to look after us. Who's going to look after us when we're old?" And Divine Mother, in her very loudest voice, she said, "You don't have faith and trust in God." Well, after that, it was like an amazing transformation. The next time that couple came, they were sitting up the front, they were talking to people, they were animated and happy as you like. It's like bingo. And then there's several little stories. There's a story about Moses, who was wandering in the desert, and he was contemplating on and convening with God, as was his wont, when he came across a man lying in the sand. So he went up to the man and he asked him, what can I do for you?" And the man said, "Water, water, please bring me water." So Moses went off to go to a nearby oasis to bring water to the man. But when he came back, the man was being devoured by lions. So Moses looked up and he said, "God, why is it that this man has this fate?" And God said, "Before you came, he was calling on me. He had faith and trust in me alone. But when you came, he lost his faith and trust in me. And such is his fate." Then there was a monk who was in a monastery for many years, learning loving kindness, and then it was time for him to leave the monastery. So, shedding his monk's clothes, he came out the monastery gate, and the monastery gate slammed behind him, and he was in the world. But as he was walking down the road, in the ditch was lying a man, or a semblance of a man, his fingers and his toes eaten away by leprosy, pus suppurating out of the sores in his face, and a great wave of compassion came over the monk who was, and he went over and knelt down in the ditch, and he took the suppurating remains of the face, the head, and put it on his knee. And this leper looked up at the monk, and with his blind eyes he said, "Who is it who comes between my God and me? Even without my body, I have my faith and trust in him." Lastly, there's a story about a man. He was a very rich merchant, but he'd lost his faith. He'd lost his faith in everything. People, the world, life, God, everything. And of course, as a consequence of that, he had no friends. Nothing had any taste for him anymore. And of course, that's a very lonely place to be. So he decided to go out and seek someone like him, who was faithless. So he filled a bag with gold, and he went out into the streets, and he thought the best place he could look for someone without faith would be amongst the beggars of the town. So he went to the beggars, and he asked each one of them what was their faith. And you know, they all had faith. He'd almost given up hope of finding anyone when he saw a man who was in the most derelict state, wearing only the flimsiest of rags, emaciated with hunger. So he went up to this man and asked him, and the man said, "Oh no, even in my worst moments I still have faith and trust in God." So the rich merchant was totally disheartened with this. So he went off to the cemetery, and he thought to himself, well, at least the dead don't have any faith. And he came to a grave. So he decided to dig a hole and put the gold in the hole. And this is what he did. But you know, the wheel of destiny turned, and all of the merchant's wealth left him. He lost his warehouses, his ships, and he became a poor man. And he too was wandering the streets. But then he suddenly remembered the bag of gold that he'd buried in the cemetery ground. So he went to the cemetery ground, to the grave, and started digging. But as fate would have it, along came a troop of soldiers and saw him digging in the grave, thought that he was a grave robber. Well, he tried to explain himself, but they didn't believe him. Of course, they hauled him off to the king for punishment. But as soon as he was in front of the king, out it blabbed his whole story of what had happened from the beginning, where he was looking for someone with faithlessness. And the king said, "Free this man, give him back his gold, and send him on his way." And then the king looked at the beggar and said, "You don't recognize me, do you?" And the merchant said, "Of course, no." The king said, "I am that beggar. I was discovered to be a long-lost heir to the throne. Now, where is your faith?" So the question that arises out of this is, what does this word faith mean for us? Very often, those who come to visit with me in an abject state of despair or whatever, the question will be asked of them, what is it that made you prevail? What is it in you that has enabled you to rise above the tribulations, the tragedies of life? Why is it that you're not a drug addict or a drunkard or the key. But if we try to find it, we can't find it. So this little collage of stories is maybe a little tweak to see if we can give expression to, find the answer to what it is that has made us prevail. That when all is abject, we're in despair, there is something there that seems to hold us. We don't fall into the abyss, we don't fall into what people call those levels of depression. even though there might be sadness and pathos and there. Isn't it so? We wouldn't be sitting here if you didn't have it. It's not possible. Not possible. So if we acknowledge it, then we must be able to express it. So these little collage of stories, to bring it down to this, faith. How would we translate it? Faith. Relative to this, not to some God out there, or religious icon. Over these last days, it's been said to several people, you have to make God real. What would you translate that to mean? Because those words can only be said to someone who has walked the path of having taken away from them all the illusions of what a God or something out there is. Those words can only be said to someone who's had everything eroded away, so there's no possibility that they can relate it to something outside them. So they have to go here. You have to make God real. What does it really mean? What is this? But just to help us along our way, we can look at this word faith. Faith. And maybe translate it. What in these stories arises for you as a translation of what that faith means? Faith.
But I don't think that they believed in themselves. So therefore then, they're not making God real.
Right. Right. That's right.
And that is exactly what I'm doing.
Right. Well, you know what to do then, don't you?
Yeah. Well, I do now. I'm hearing those stories.
Yeah. You bet. You bet.
One could translate it into life.
Yes? Absolutely. Life.
Life.
Life. Yes.
Second that, kind of like, well, I've got life, so I better do something with it.
But when we're in that place, it's easy, because we no longer have a mind that's going to jump to some icon or some representation of it. So it forces us inward. Do you see the ploys that are used here? It forces us inward to acknowledge that which seems to be inexpressible, but can be expressed, has to be expressed. So, food for thought. Thank you, thank you.